was pretty bad for the industry and business owners as a general. Those that own second homes buying a new property will pay an additional 2% stamp duty land tax charge on top of the additional 3% that was already in play for those people that bought through limited companies and had second homes.
The real killer is we've got a few bits to go through on the budget.
There was a lot of chat about coming into play that hasn't been, and there's also a few curveballs that obviously really shit for the industry. But on the whole, it felt like it wasn't as bad as it could have been, and some of the things that they touted didn't come to fruition. As a whole, I think it was pretty bad for the industry and business owners as a general. I think there's a few key ones that I think came out that impact business owners in the property industry way more than anyone else. And the big one on most people's lists, and the key indicator after the budget of market sentiment, is probably Facebook, Instagram, and probably TikTok for the most part in terms of what people's thoughts are. And literally the day after they announce it, it's live and everyone's going to be paying an extra 2%. So for anyone that missed this, those that own second homes buying a new property will pay an additional 2% stamp duty land tax charge on top of the additional 3% that was already in play for those people that bought through limited companies and had second homes as buy-to-let. So basically we're paying 5% additional on top of the basics SDLT rates as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge one for us. Everyone feels very safe sat in their limited company structure. Obviously, I would classify as a young companies, XP Property and Central Suites being young companies. Obviously, this stamp duty change is purely for residential purchases. So it's only coming into effect for a second residential purchase within a limited company or a personal name. The Conservative government have been hammering already with section notices on private landlords with not being able to offset mortgage rates on their sort of rental properties, so that the individual landlord has always been hammered for the last 6-7 years since that sort of taxation came in, and everyone's been moving into a limited company structure because they feel comfortable. And I actually thought it would be very difficult to charge that rate within a limited company, because if you also think about it, there's companies that aren't property developers or property investors that may end up buying residential properties, so it's prohibiting a bit of business growth for them. But for us, it's huge. We've got 2 projects, residential purchases in legals, and I was telling Ben the other day, one of them has got a total SDLT liability of £8,000 and the other has got a tax liability of £20,000. Both of those, the 8,000 is now 5,000 more, so 13,000, and the 20,000 is now 30,000 in a limited company structure. So just as a result of the budget, that's £15,000 that's been increased as a cost to those projects. Obviously, we look at things slightly differently. We look on the end value and minus all the costs. To me, £5,000 is a lot of money to a person, but if you look in a business context, you've always got to analyse what the sort of opportunity cost of that is. So if you're delivering a £5 million scheme and you have a £5,000 bill, that's not really the end of the world. But this is obviously quite a large percentage of that asset value being a 2% increase. The real killer is the 3% surcharge that came in for secondary purchases was actually a temporary measure. So what the Labour government have done is they've taken a Conservative government temporary measure of a 3% surcharge, and they're now whacking on 2% onto that when it was only a temporary measure in the first place. So I do think this is probably going to be here for a long time, because you would only do that to that measure and to that extent if you mean business. Obviously, for the time being, it's painful for people like us that have got those deals in legals. I know a lot of people already that are sharing that with the seller or pushing it completely on the seller. One of our purchases has actually been by seller's fault that we haven't already completed. They've been slow. So I'm looking to push that whole £5,000 liability, deduct it off the sale price basically. But who knows where that goes. But I think the buyers of the world are going to be trying to initially push it onto the sellers. And then from here on out, when you're analysing projects, it's just going to reflect in the land value or the property value, because someone's got to wear that. And then for us, it's commercial decisions. So those numbers just go into our spreadsheet and we can pay up to X amount less, or 2% less.
That expectation of vendors and landowners at the moment is still so high and just continues to be. They've got a figure in their head and they're not going to shift. Like, what's going to happen? Because people aren't going to be able to pay the levels that are expected from a lot of landowners at the moment. Their expectations won't go anywhere else. Yet the available kind of offer price that us developers are going to have after running all our calculations and realizing, you can't pay as much for it, we're going to be making offers that are way below their expectations, and just deals won't get done. And the whole point of this was to stimulate the housing growth and the number of houses that we deliver. And this is just going to put another damper on it for those people buying, big houses and expensive houses, London and surrounding areas that are over £1 million, I think the tax rate on that £1 million, if you've got a second home, is now 17% SDLT. I mean, that's absolutely astronomical. It's going to fill those coffers for the government pretty quickly, because there'll be a lot of people that will be stung by this extra 2% and will be paying that extra 2%. So expectations are still going to be where they are. It's just going to put a squeeze on things even more so than it was already. That's one of the issues. Another thing relating to property, and to be honest, I feel like it's a bit of a misconception out there at the moment. I see a lot of posts about capital gains tax and it not being fair on property investors, property developers. They've changed the rate. It's gone from 18% to 24% or 10% to 18%, depending on kind of what bracket you're in. But my understanding is it's not actually related to the property sort of side of things. So from a business and a share sale, the capital gains on a business and a share sale, there's been an increase. But from a property perspective, the CGT hasn't increased. So I do think people need to kind of check facts around that, because it seems to be a bit of a common misconception. And most of the people out there buying properties and selling properties, I don't actually know what the figure is, but selling the limited company that the property is owned in is a way smaller percentage of transactions than people just buying the asset and buying the property directly, where the CGT hasn't changed. So if you're doing share sales, if you're selling your business, you will get hit by an increase in CGT. That being said, there was a lot of talk about the government changing the assets disposal relief, i.e. the previous entrepreneurs relief, which means that on the first £1 million of any trading business that you sell, the tax on that was only 10%. So if you're selling a company for £1 million, you're only paying £100,000 in tax, very low tax rate. That hasn't actually changed. There was a lot of talk about it being changed, but it hasn't done. So I do think that is a positive that they haven't made those changes. But still, the CGT increase for businesses is a bit of a blow. Next on my list is the national insurance, which I do think is a massive change. And I can see, Jack, you've put in some example figures here. For companies that are much bigger than ours, bringing it back down to the level that we're at, I ran a couple of figures in my head last night in terms of XP surveys and Aura. And this national insurance increase and change is going to add over £10,000 a year cost to those two businesses. So SME businesses with like 1 to 15 people in them, you are going to be probably paying an extra 5 to 15 grand in extra national insurance contributions, which is a massive change. And what this table in front of you, for those that are watching on YouTube, shows the massive impact of the minimum wage increases as well. So for those in employment, obviously great news. If you were at that lower bracket in terms of just being paid minimum wage, the minimum wage has gone up by a significant amount. I think it's like 7%. Depending on your age, but that will have a massive impact on employers, obviously. Combined with the national insurance changes, the increases in minimum wage, it will have a massive impact on the bottom line of companies. Now, most people will say, it just means that prices are going to increase. So for the consumer, if you used to have gross sales of £10 million and you increase your fees by 10%, you're going to counteract a lot of these changes. This is a sort of table that breaks down the sort of net margin that company would have gained before Rachel Reeves. Gross sales of £10 million, net sales of £8.3 million, payroll was just under £3 million, so 2.916 million. So there's an EBITDA sort of net margin, I guess, of £833,000. This is an example. So basically, this company makes 10% net margin on a £10 million gross sales figure. The new framework of national insurance contributions and the minimum wage changes, the same net sales figure of £8.3 million has a increase of almost £3 million in terms of the payroll jump, and the net profit margin of that company drops from 833,000 to 536,000. That's a difference of almost £300,000, taking the margin from 10%, which is already slim for a company to make a 10% margin. Not a lot has to go wrong or things change for that margin to really be put under pressure. So under the new changes, that 10% net margin has actually dropped to 6.43%. So 35% of your profit is going out the door with these changes. And that's absolutely massive for small businesses that are probably already struggling and trying to battle rising out of COVID and coming through that and changes that have happened. So these NI changes, the national insurance increases, the minimum wage increases, all of these things will hit business owners like you and us. Anything on the NI that you wanted to touch on, Jack?
No, not specifically. I think what we've just analysed is a fairly good rule of thumb for small businesses. It's going to cost you about £1,000 per employee is an easy metric to sort of work off. Someone's going to have to wear that cost, and who's going to be warned by in the short term? The business has got to swallow that. But when it comes to pay reviews or bringing on new staff, that decision has got to be really carefully tread by the business owners, because there isn't a 10% margin where they can go, you've done really well, we've had a good year, we've got a 4% margin to play with until we get to 6%. You're already on that breadline. So I don't think it's logical. I think that the grounds of any good country is built up from the sort of startups all the way up to bigger companies, and the startups become bigger companies, and that sort of has an osmosis effect. So super difficult, because the businesses that are being impacted the most are probably the businesses that are significantly operating and have a team, but not the sort of one-man bands. They'll still be perfectly fine. So it's kind of that grassroots entities that are really going to struggle much more and grow slower. Yeah, not good, not good. I think this is probably the most impactful aside from the SDLT.
Yeah. I mean, fundamentally, you as a business owner, you can't control these things. These are the uncontrollable events that happen. You have to pivot and deal with and factor in. You are in control of your own business, your finances, your direction of flow. You need to just find a way around this and make it work, and get to the profitable levels that you expect, and not assume that the government will help you, because they're not going to. No one's going to come in and save the day. So you're going to have to pivot and find a way around this and dig yourself out of holes that the government have made for you. The other one is inheritance tax and pensions. They're pushing your pensions into the grabs of that inheritance tax kind of process. It's not something that I'm fully fluent in. I know that it will affect a lot of people in terms of the amount of allowance that they have left. And it varies between if you're in a marriage, if you've got a couple, but it's something that is a big shake up. And I don't think people truly understand it, because they're not in that place yet. A lot of people don't think of that until way later on in life and try to deal with it way too late. So yeah, it's something that I'm going to try and get my head around over the next couple of weeks, just how that does affect us with pensions and inheritance taxes. But I do know that trusts are a very good way of kind of protecting a lot of your assets and your estate. So if you've not set up trusts before, speak to a specialist about how that could work for you. Speak to a wealth advisor, somebody that organizes sort of family tax, family wealth, family affairs, to make sure that you are protected going forward and have everything in place that you might need.